Kid, you have no idea what you're wearing. Cole Harrison said it quietly, barely above a whisper, but in that diner with every person frozen and staring. Those 8 words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan Carter looked down at the cracked leather jacket on his shoulders. The same jacket he'd grabbed off the hook in his grandfather's garage 100 times without thinking. The same jacket he'd worn to work, to the grocery store, to every late night shift that felt too cold and too empty without Billy's memory wrapped around him. He had no idea it would stop a room full of Hell's Angels dead in their tracks. If you're watching right now and this story already has your heart beating faster, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Ethan Carter was 26 years old and he was tired. Not the kind of tired that a full night of sleep fixes. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after 3 months of grief, after funeral arrangements and estate paperwork, and his mother crying in the kitchen at 2 in the morning when she thought everyone else was asleep. The kind of tired that comes from watching someone you loved more than almost anyone disappear from the world without any warning at all. Billy Carter had died on a Tuesday. Massive heart attack. He'd been alone in his workshop, which was the only way Billy ever wanted to go, surrounded by the tools he loved with grease on his hands and a half-finished engine on the workbench. The paramedics said he probably never felt a thing. Ethan's mother had held onto that detail like a life raft. Ethan had held onto the jacket. It was hanging right inside the workshop door, the one place Billy always left it when he wasn't wearing it. Old black leather, the hide worn so soft in places it almost felt like cloth, cracked along the collar, and both forearms in a pattern that looked less like damage and more like character. The kind of jacket that had earned every mark it carried. There was a Hell's Angels patch on the back, but it was older than anything Ethan had ever seen the club wearing in the present day. The colors were faded, the embossment nearly flat, the threading frayed at the edges like the whole thing had been sewn and then slowly surrendered to time. Ethan hadn't thought much about it. His grandfather had been around motorcycles his whole life. The patch was ancient history. Nobody was going to care about some relic from 30 years ago on the back of a dead man's jacket. He'd grabbed it off the hook the night of the funeral and hadn't taken it off since. His Uncle Ray ran a garage 2 miles from the house where Ethan grew up, a working shop that handled everything from oil changes to full engine rebuilds, and Ethan had been working there since he was 17. Ray had offered him extra shifts after Billy died. Not out of charity, but because he genuinely needed the help and because he understood that Ethan needed somewhere to put his hands. Grief in Ray's philosophy was best handled by keeping busy. Ethan agreed. So he worked. He came in early and stayed late. He crawled under trucks and rebuilt carburetors and replaced brake lines and answered the phone and swept the floor and did everything Ray asked without complaint. He wore the jacket every single night because the garage got cold after dark and because wearing it felt like keeping something alive that didn't deserve to be gone. He'd been doing this for 3 months when he stopped at the diner. The Crossroads Diner had been on Route 9 for as long as anyone in town could remember. It was the kind of place that existed everywhere in Middle America. The booths were patch vinyl, the coffee was always too hot, the pie was legitimately excellent, and the clientele was a rotating cast of locals, truckers, and the occasional traveler who'd gotten off the highway looking for something that didn't come in a paper bag. Ethan had eaten there 100 times over his life. He knew the owner, a heavy-set woman named Marlene who had known his grandfather and always gave Billy extra pie without being asked. He pulled into the parking lot at 9:47 on a Thursday night. He'd just finished a late shift and he was hungry in the way that only happens when you've been working with your hands for 6 hours and your last meal was a gas station sandwich at noon. He needed real food. He needed to sit down somewhere that had light and noise and wasn't his empty apartment. He didn't notice the motorcycles parked outside until he was already halfway to the door. There were 11 of them, big machines well-maintained parked in a neat diagonal line that took up half the lot. He registered them the way you register anything when you're tired and hungry distantly without real processing. He pushed through the diner door. The bell above the door rang, and the room went quiet. Not the gradual hush that happens when someone new walks into a crowded place. This was instantaneous, like a switch being thrown. Every conversation stopped at the same moment. Marlene, who had been laughing at something behind the counter, went still with her mouth slightly open. A trucker 2 booths from the door looked up from his coffee and didn't look away. And the 7 men sitting along the counter and in the nearest booth, big men road-worn, wearing Hell's Angels cuts with patches that were current and sharp, and nothing like the faded relic on Ethan's back, every single one of them turned their heads in his direction. They weren't looking at his face, they were looking at his back. Ethan stopped walking because the room had stopped breathing, and something deep in his gut, some animal instinct that doesn't need conscious thought to operate, told him to be still. He stood just inside the door for what felt like a long time, long enough for the silence to get heavy, long enough for him to feel it pressing against his skin. One of the men at the counter stood up. He was maybe 60, maybe a little older, with a face that looked like it had been through weather, both literal and figurative. His hair was gray-white and pulled back, and he moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned a long time ago that hurrying was for people who hadn't figured out that the world stepped aside for men who didn't rush. He walked the length of the counter without taking his eyes off Ethan's back, and then he stepped around to stand in front of him. He looked at Ethan's face for one moment, then he looked down at the jacket, then back up. "Kid," he said, and his voice was low enough that it probably didn't carry past the two of them, "you have no idea what you're wearing." Ethan opened his mouth. He almost laughed, almost said something like, "What are you talking about? It's just a jacket. It was my grandfather's. Is there a problem here?" But something about the man's eyes stopped him. There was no threat in those eyes. What was there instead was something Ethan couldn't immediately name. Something that looked almost like shock, like recognition, like a man who'd just seen something he'd believed was permanently gone. "It's my grandfather's jacket," Ethan said carefully. "He passed away a few months back." The man stared at him. "What was your grandfather's name?" "Billy Carter." The silence in the diner, which Ethan had thought was already complete, somehow deepened. He heard someone at the far end of the counter exhale. He heard the trucker, 2 booths away, set down his coffee cup very slowly. The gray-haired man in front of him closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When he opened them, something had shifted in his expression that Ethan couldn't read at all. "My name is Cole Harrison," the man said. "Sit down. I'll buy you whatever you want to eat, and then we need to talk." "Come." Ethan almost said no. The part of him that had been raised with reasonable caution, the part that recognized he was alone in a diner with 7 Hell's Angels members who had all gone silent at the sight of him, that part said, "Walk back to your truck, drive home, eat whatever's in the refrigerator." But there was something else operating underneath that caution. Curiosity that had been awake since the moment the room went quiet. And something else, something that felt embarrassingly like recognition of his own. Like whatever Cole Harrison knew, some part of Ethan had always suspected there was something to know. He sat down. Marlene brought him coffee and a menu without making eye contact with anyone, which was fine. Cole Harrison sat across from him and folded his hands on the table and didn't say anything while Ethan ordered. The other men at the counter had resumed talking, but quietly, and more than once Ethan caught someone glancing over. When Marlene walked away, Cole spoke. "How long ago did Billy pass?" 3 months, Ethan said. "March." Cole nodded slowly. Did he ever talk to you about the patch?" "No," Ethan said. "He never talked about his biker days much at all. My mom said he walked away from all of it before she was even a teenager. She never knew much either. He had the jacket. It was always in the workshop." "He kept it," Cole said almost to himself. "Is that unusual?" Cole looked at him steadily. When a man leaves the club, and I mean really leaves, walks away, takes the patch off most of the time, the patch doesn't go with him. Most of the time it stays, or it gets taken. What Billy did keeping it, holding on to it, that was a statement, whether he meant it as one or not. Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "What kind of statement?" Cole was quiet for a moment, then, "Billy Carter was one of the most respected men I ever knew. And I've known a lot of men in my life. I was 23 when I met him, and I thought I understood what respect meant. I didn't. Not until I watched how Billy operated. He worked in a garage," Ethan said. "He fixed cars and motorcycles his whole life. He was quiet. He was just my grandfather." "To you," Cole said. "Yeah, to you he was that." He paused. "But there was a time when Billy Carter's name meant something very specific to a whole lot of very specific people. And the patch on the back of that jacket you're wearing wasn't just a club patch. It was a different patch. A version of the patch that doesn't exist anymore. one that belonged to a chapter that Billy essentially built from nothing. Ethan set down his coffee. I don't understand. I know you don't. Cole leaned forward slightly. That's why I'm talking to you right now, instead of just watching you eat your dinner and leave. Because you walked in here wearing something you don't understand, and the men in this room recognized it immediately, and if I hadn't stood up first, someone else would have said something to you before the night was over. And not everyone in every room you might walk into is going to be as patient as we're trying to be right now. The word patient landed with a weight that Ethan felt in his stomach. Are you telling me I'm in some kind of danger? Cole held his gaze. I'm telling you the jacket has a history, and the history has people attached to it. And some of those people have spent a very long time trying to make sure that history stayed buried. He sat back. Your grandfather walked away from something that someone else didn't want him to walk away from. And the person who didn't want him to leave has been around a long time and has a long memory and does not forgive things. He paused. Billy's been gone 3 months. That means whoever is watching, and believe me, someone is always watching, knows by now that Billy died. The question is whether they know that jacket is still out in the world. Ethan looked down at his own chest, at the sleeves of the jacket, at the cracked leather that had felt like protection and warmth and grief and memory for 3 months. Who are you talking about? He asked. Cole said the name quietly without drama, the way people say the names of things they have learned to be careful about. Victor Kane. Ethan didn't recognize the name. He said so. Cole nodded like that was expected. Billy would have made sure of that. He would have kept Victor Kane as far away from his family as he could possibly manage. That was one of the conditions when he left. Left what exactly? Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, drank half of it, and set it back down with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision about how much to tell. 32 years ago, he said, there was a chapter operating out of this part of the state that ran differently from most. And I mean that in the specific sense, the values it operated by were different. What it stood for was different. He met Ethan's eyes. You know what the reputation is. Bikers, clubs, the kind of stories that end up in newspapers and courtrooms. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that reputation came from nowhere because it didn't. Okay, Ethan said. But Billy's chapter in the beginning, before everything changed, that chapter operated on a different code. And Billy wasn't just a member, he was the architect of that code. He was the one who laid out what the rules were. Not the official rules, the real rules. The ones that determined what you did when a family in the community got in trouble. What you did when someone who couldn't defend themselves needed someone to step in front of them. Cole paused. The ones that said you used whatever strength you had in service of people who had no strength of their own. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about his grandfather, about the man he'd known his whole life, methodical patient, a man of very few words and absolutely consistent action, a man who always seemed to know exactly what he thought about a situation even before Ethan had finished explaining it. A man who had never raised his voice in Ethan's memory. A man who fixed things. That sounds like him, Ethan said quietly. Something moved across Cole Harrison's face that might have been grief. Yeah, he said. It does. The food came. Ethan ate without tasting much of it. Cole drank his coffee and talked in the measured, unhurried way of a man who has chosen his words carefully for most of his adult life and long since stopped needing to rush. At walking back out, Frank said, on all, he let that land. I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm just being honest. That ring showing up in a stranger's hand is going to raise questions, and some of those questions are going to come out looking like accusations. You need to be ready for that. Ethan nodded. He took the paper. He put it in his jacket pocket alongside the ring, and for a moment the two things, the note and the ring, occupied the same space, which felt oddly appropriate. Frank, Ethan said as he was about to leave, why are you helping me? Frank considered the question. Because you could have sold that ring 2 days ago. You didn't. That tells me something about who you are. He picked up a wrench and turned back to the engine he'd been working on. Go before I change my mind. Ethan went. None of it was legal in a clean sense, Cole said carefully. I'm not going to pretend it was. We used the reputation when the reputation was what it took. But nobody got hurt who didn't choose to put themselves in a position to get hurt. And a lot of people who would have been crushed didn't get crushed. What changed? Ethan asked. Cole's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Money changed it, the same thing that changes everything. New people came in, people who looked at what the chapter had built, the reach, the reputation, the relationships, and saw a platform for something else. Something that wasn't about protecting anyone. Something that was entirely about profit and control. He set his cup down. Victor Kane was one of those people. He came in from outside connected enough that he couldn't just be turned away, and he started working on the chapter from the inside. Changing priorities, pushing out the older way of operating, replacing people who held on to the old code with people who cared about money. And Billy was the last one standing, Cole said. Everybody else had already made peace with the new direction, or left quietly, or gotten managed. Billy was the only one who stood in front of Victor Kane and said no directly. Said it in front of other people. Said it loud enough that it couldn't be ignored. Cole looked at Ethan steadily. Victor Kane does not have a good relationship with the word no, and he absolutely does not have a good relationship with being said no to publicly. What happened? Billy walked away. He removed his own patch, something you almost never see done voluntarily, and he left. He told Victor that the patch meant nothing if the people wearing it had abandoned everything the patch was supposed to stand for. He said it right to Victor's face, in front of witnesses. Cole paused. And then he went home to his family and his garage, and he spent the next 30 years being the best grandfather and the most reliable mechanic in the county. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. Something that felt like the specific ache of learning something about someone you loved, that you should have always known, that feels both entirely new and completely inevitable at the same time. Victor never came after him, he asked. Victor didn't need to. Billy walking away. Billy making the statement he made when he left that hurt Victor in ways that a physical confrontation never would have. What Billy said publicly stayed in people's minds. And Victor has spent 30 years knowing that somewhere out there was a man who had looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong, and then proved it by simply living a good life. Cole looked down at his hands. The best revenge Billy Carter ever took on Victor Kane was exactly what he did. He just lived with integrity quietly for the rest of his life, and Victor never forgot it. Ethan sat with me for a moment. And now Billy's gone, he said. And now Billy's gone, Cole agreed. And his grandson walked into a diner wearing the patch that Victor Kane has spent 30 years trying to make people forget ever meant something different than what he turned it into. The diner had thinned out around them. Marlene was wiping down the counter at the far end, making herself deliberately busy. The other riders had mostly drifted. 2 remained at the counter with their backs turned, but Ethan had the feeling they were listening. What do you think is going to happen? Ethan asked Cole. I think, Cole said slowly, that within the next week or so, Victor Kane is going to hear that someone is walking around wearing Billy Carter's patch. And I think when he hears that, he's going to want to know everything about that person. He met Ethan's eyes. And I think you need to understand what you're holding before that conversation happens. What am I holding? Ethan asked. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Ethan watched him weigh something, some internal calculation about how much truth was right to deliver to a 26-year-old mechanic sitting in a diner who'd only come in because he was hungry. I don't know everything, Cole finally said. I know pieces. I know that Billy didn't just walk away. Billy walked away with something he believed was important enough to protect and important enough to eventually pass on. I don't know what exactly, but I know that Victor Kane has never fully stopped looking for it. He reached into his jacket and took out a card, plain just a phone number. He slid it across the table to Ethan. I don't want you to panic, he said. I don't want you to do anything dramatic, but I want you to be aware, and I want you to call me if anything seems off, if anyone approaches you, if anything strange happens, if you hear a name you don't recognize. Can you do that? Ethan picked up the card. He looked at it. He looked up at Cole Harrison's weathered face, at the quiet weight in it that came from knowing more than he was saying and choosing deliberately to release the information slowly. Cole, he said, what did my grandfather do that was important enough for a man like Victor Kane to spend 30 years angry about? Cole stood up. He laid cash on the table, more than enough for both their meals. I don't know the whole answer to that, he said, but I think you're going to find out. He looked at the jacket one more time. Billy kept that jacket for a reason. People who keep things for reasons usually have a place where the reason is stored. He looked at Ethan's face. Think about that. He walked back toward the counter. The other two men stood without being signaled, and all three of them moved toward the door in that same unhurried, deliberate way men who had learned long ago that a room waits for them, not the other way around. Ethan sat alone at the booth. His food was mostly finished. His coffee had gone cold. He reached back and touched the patch on the jacket with his fingertips. Old leather, faded threads, a symbol he'd carried for 3 months without knowing what he was carrying. He thought about his grandfather's workshop, about every drawer, every shelf, every corner he'd been in and out of 100 times over his life. He thought about the jacket hanging by the door and what Cole had said: people who keep things for reasons usually have a place where the reason is stored. And then he thought about the one place in that workshop he'd never opened. Not because he'd been told not to, because he'd never had a reason. The old metal lockbox on the bottom shelf of the workbench. The one that had always been there. The one that he had looked at his whole life and simply registered as part of the furniture. The one that Billy had never mentioned once in 26 years. Ethan put down his coffee cup. He left cash on the table, grabbed the jacket tighter around his shoulders, and walked out into the night. He drove straight to the workshop. The box was exactly where it had always been. He'd been looking at it for 2 decades without ever really seeing it. Small, dull gray metal, the kind of fireproof document box that hardware stores sold for $40, the kind that looked like it held nothing more interesting than a mortgage deed or an old insurance policy. He found a key for it almost immediately. It was hanging on a nail directly above the box, so obvious a hiding spot that it had effectively been invisible his entire life. He picked it up. He stood there for a moment with the key in his hand. Then he unlocked the box. The documents inside were organized. That was the first thing he noticed. His grandfather's handwriting, neat and deliberate, on labeled folders. Billy had never been a man who did things sloppily. Whatever this was, he'd maintained it the same way he maintained an engine: with care, with attention, with the understanding that things kept properly were things that worked when you needed them. Ethan opened the first folder. Names, dates, addresses, records of payments made and threats delivered. Documentation that someone had compiled meticulously over years, maybe decades of careful observation and precise record keeping. He opened the second folder. Photographs. People he didn't recognize in settings he didn't immediately understand, but with names and dates written on the backs in Billy's handwriting. He opened the third folder. A letter addressed to no one specifically, or perhaps to everyone specifically, in Billy's careful hand. The date on it was 18 months before he died. Ethan read it. He read it twice. By the time he finished the second reading, his hands were not entirely steady. He sat down on the floor of his grandfather's workshop with the letter in his lap and the lockbox open beside him. The jacket was on his shoulders. The fluorescent light above him hummed its familiar, tuneless note. He understood now why Cole Harrison had stood up when he walked into the diner. He understood now what his grandfather had been carrying for 30 years. And he understood with a clarity that came from somewhere much deeper than thought that the jacket on his back was not just a memory. It was a responsibility. And it had just landed on him. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat on the concrete floor of Billy's workshop for a long time after he finished reading the letter, long enough for the fluorescent light above him to flicker twice, and long enough for the cold to work its way through the jacket and into his shoulders. He didn't move. He read the letter a third time, then a fourth. Not because the words changed, but because some part of him kept hoping that the next reading would somehow reframe what he was looking at into something smaller, something more manageable, something that didn't mean what it clearly and unambiguously meant. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this, which meant it was addressed to him. Billy had known that much. He'd known that eventually someone would find the box, and he'd known, or at least calculated with the quiet precision that governed everything he ever did, that the most likely person to find it was Ethan. He'd left the key in plain sight above the box, like a man who wasn't hiding the box so much as waiting for the right person to be ready for it. The letter said in Billy Carter's careful handwriting that he had spent the better part of 20 years documenting the activities of a man named Victor Kane. It said that the documentation was thorough, organized, and legally viable, that he had consulted quietly and without revealing why with 2 different attorneys over the years to make sure what he had was the kind of thing that could actually be used. It said that he had never used it himself because the cost of using it directly would have landed on people who didn't deserve to pay it, his family first among them. It said that he understood this was a coward's answer and he had made peace with that judgment. And then it said something that hit Ethan like a physical thing. It said, I kept the jacket because I never stopped believing someone would be ready to finish what I started. I kept the jacket because the patch meant something once, and it can mean something again if the right person decides it should. I kept it for you, Ethan, even though I never found a way to tell you why. Ethan had to put the letter down after that sentence. He put it down on his knee, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and he breathed very carefully through his nose until the tightness in his throat loosened enough to let him keep reading. The last paragraph was short. It said, don't be afraid of this. Be careful with it, and find Cole Harrison before anyone else finds you. Tell him what you found. He'll know what to do with the first step. After that, you're going to have to trust yourself. Ethan hadn't known Cole Harrison's name before 2 hours ago. His grandfather had been counting on a meeting that hadn't happened yet, had banked on a coincidence, or maybe not a coincidence. Maybe Billy had arranged it, somehow had found a way to make sure the paths crossed at the right moment that had come true in a diner off Route 9 on a Thursday night, because Ethan was hungry and grabbed the first jacket off the hook. He sat there on the floor and felt very clearly, and without any confusion at all, that his grandfather had been a great deal more deliberate about everything than Ethan had ever understood. He took out Cole Harrison's card. He stared at the number. It was past midnight. He dialed anyway. Cole picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, or he'd been expecting the call. It's Ethan Carter, Ethan said. I know, Cole said. You found something. It wasn't a question. There's a box, Ethan said. In his workshop. I found it tonight. There are documents, Cole. There are years and years of documents and a letter. He stopped. He knew I'd call you. He wrote your name in the letter. He said to find you before anyone else found me. The silence on Cole's end lasted long enough that Ethan pulled the phone away from his ear to check that the call was still connected. Then Cole said quietly and with a weight that told Ethan this was a man processing something he'd been waiting a very long time to process. He kept it all. I always wondered. I always hoped he had. You knew about the documents. I knew Billy was careful, Cole said. I knew he paid attention to things and wrote things down and didn't throw information away. I knew that much. I didn't know what he had or how much. Another pause. Ethan, don't touch anything else in that box tonight. Don't move it. Don't let anyone know you found it. Lock the workshop and go home and get some sleep if you can, and I will be at that workshop at 8 in the morning. You don't know where the workshop is. Billy Carter's garage has been in the same place for 27 years. I know where it is. Something in Cole's voice shifted. And Ethan, I need you to listen to me carefully right now. Whatever you read in that box, whatever you're feeling about it tonight, hold on to that. Don't let it go. But don't act on it yet. Can you do that? Ethan looked at the box, at the folders inside it, at 30 years of his grandfather's patience stacked up in neat labeled rows. Yeah, he said, I can do that. He locked the box. He locked the workshop. He drove home with the card in his shirt pocket and the jacket on his back, and Billy Carter's last words moving through his mind like water that had found a channel and wasn't going to stop. He did not sleep. Cole Harrison arrived at 7:43, which was 17 minutes early, which told Ethan something about the kind of man Cole was. He came alone. He stood outside the workshop door and waited without knocking until Ethan opened it, and then he stepped inside and didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the space, the workbench, the tools hung in their places. The engine parts organized on shelves with the same meticulous logic that governed the box, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to hide. I haven't been in here in a long time, Cole said. You were here before? Ethan said. Once, a long time ago. He didn't elaborate. He crossed to the workbench and looked at the box that Ethan had set there. Can I? Ethan nodded. Cole opened the box with the care of a man handling something fragile. He lifted out the first folder and opened it and stood reading for a long time without speaking. He went through the second folder, the third. He read Billy's letter last, and when he finished it, he set it down on the workbench and put both hands flat on the surface and stood there with his head bowed for a moment. 30 years, he said quietly. Not to Ethan, just to the air. Is it enough? Ethan asked. What's in there? Is it the kind of thing that can actually do something? Cole lifted his head. It's more than enough. What Billy built here, he stopped, looked back down at the folders. This is the kind of documentation that prosecutors dream about. This isn't just observations. This is corroborated records. Names, dates, payments, witnesses. Billy had sources I didn't even know he had. He shook his head slowly. He was the most patient man I've ever known in my life. He sat on this for 30 years because he was waiting for the right moment, or the right person. He was waiting for me, Ethan said. Cole looked at him. He was waiting for someone ready to use it. Yeah. Ethan leaned against the workbench. He'd been standing in this workshop his entire life. He'd learned to change oil here, to read an engine, to tell by sound and feel what a machine needed. He'd watched his grandfather work in this space with the focused, unhurried attention that Billy brought to everything. He'd thought he knew this place completely. He was understanding now that he'd never really known it at all. Tell me about Victor Kane, he said. Cole pulled a stool from under the workbench and sat down. He looked like a man settling in for something he had been carrying a long time and was finally, after decades of wait, about to set down. Victor Kane, he said, is 71 years old. He came up from nothing on the South Side, and he learned very early that the fastest way to get what you wanted was to make people afraid of what would happen if they didn't give it to you. He's smart, genuinely smart, not street clever, actually intelligent. And he understood something that most people in his position didn't, which is that the most durable kind of fear isn't the kind that comes from direct threats. The most durable kind of fear is ambient. It's the kind that hangs in the air of a whole community without anyone being able to point directly at the source. He paused, let that land. Victor built that kind of fear into the biker community over about 15 years. He did it by working through other people, by making himself the man who could make your problem go away for a price. He never got his hands dirty directly. He didn't have to. By the time he pushed into Billy's chapter, he already had enough leverage over enough people that resistance was mostly theoretical. Except for Billy, Ethan said. Except for Billy, Cole agreed. And the reason Billy was the exception wasn't just courage, though God knows he had that. It was information. Billy had started documenting Victor before Victor fully understood what Billy was doing. By the time Victor moved to push him out, Billy had 2 years of records already accumulated. He looked at the box. Victor didn't know about the documentation. He thought Billy walked away because Billy was principled, but ultimately manageable. He thought he'd won. He hadn't won, Ethan said. He hadn't won, Cole confirmed. He'd just driven the fight underground for 3 decades. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was processing it in the mechanic's way that was the only way his mind really worked, taking a complex problem and finding the load-bearing piece, the single point that everything else turned on. What is Victor doing now? He asked. Cole's expression shifted in a way that told Ethan the answer wasn't simple. He's still operating, older, more careful, better insulated. He uses legitimate business fronts now, property management, a couple of construction companies, a security firm. He's moved money around for long enough that the lines between what's clean and what isn't are genuinely blurry. But the core of what he does is still the same. He met Ethan's eyes. He identifies people and businesses that have something he wants, property routes, leverage, and he applies pressure until they move or comply. Quietly, patiently, the same way he always did. Is he connected to this area still? Cole nodded once. Is he currently doing something specific? Someone specific? Ethan asked. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, You remember me mentioning the hardware store last night? The family Billy had protected years back. Ethan went very still. The Ortegas, Cole said. Roberto Ortega opened that store 40 years ago. His daughter runs it now, Maria. She's about your mother's age. Good woman. Works hard, gives back to the community, employs people from the neighborhood. He stopped. Victor's construction company has been making offers on that property for 2 years. The Ortegas have turned down everyone. 3 months ago, the pressure shifted from offers to something else. What kind of something else? Supplier problems, inventory that gets delayed or damaged, a small fire in the storage room that the fire marshal ruled accidental and that probably was, but maybe wasn't. A visit from a health inspector that resulted in a citation for violations that hadn't existed on the previous inspection. Cole's voice was measured, factual, deliberately absent of emotion. The kind of pressure that doesn't leave fingerprints. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew what that kind of pressure looked like. He'd seen it happen to small businesses his whole life, not from organized crime specifically, but from the general machinery of larger forces grinding down on smaller ones. He'd seen people fold under it, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't afford not to. When did Billy die? Cole asked. March, Ethan said. Then he understood the question. Victor knows the timing. He knows the man who made the original promise to the Ortegas is gone. The pressure on the Ortega family increased in April, Cole said quietly. The silence between them was its own kind of communication. Ethan looked at the box on the workbench. He looked at the jacket hanging by the door where he'd put it when he came in. He thought about his grandfather, about Billy Carter, who had spent 30 years living a quiet life and carefully, patiently building a case that he'd never had the right moment to use, or maybe the right person, who had kept a jacket and a key and a box in plain sight waiting. Cole, he said, the Ortega family, Billy made them a promise. It's in the letter. He writes about it specifically. I know, Cole said. And now Victor Kane is coming after them, and Billy's gone, and the only thing standing between the Ortegas and losing everything they built is a box of documents in an old jacket and a mechanic who didn't even know his grandfather's real history until last night. He stopped. That's where we are. That's where we are, Cole confirmed. Ethan looked at him directly. What do you think Billy would have done? Cole Harrison looked at Ethan Carter for a long moment. He looked at him the way a man looks at something when he's measuring it, not skeptically, not doubtfully, but with the specific attention of someone trying to understand what they're actually dealing with. I think Billy would have done exactly what he always did, Cole said. He'd have figured out who needed protecting. He'd have figured out what he had available to protect them with, and then he'd have acted quietly, without drama, without waiting for the perfect moment, because the perfect moment doesn't exist. He paused. I think he raised a daughter who raised a son, and I think he knew what that son would do when he finally understood what he was carrying. Ethan took a slow breath. He thought about Maria Ortega in a hardware store that her father had built with 40 years of work. He thought about the kind of pressure that doesn't leave fingerprints. He thought about 3 months of accelerating damage since Billy died. I need to know everything, Ethan said. Everything you know about Victor's current operation. Everything about the Ortega property and what's been happening to them. I need to understand the full picture before I do anything. I can give you that, Cole said, and I need to know who else is still around, who else from Billy's time, who understood what that chapter was supposed to be about, who else might have something to contribute. Cole looked at him. Why? Because a bomb of documents is only useful if someone takes it somewhere, Ethan said. And I'm 26 and I work in a garage and I have no standing in any of this by myself, but Billy didn't build this alone, and I'm not going to use it alone. Something shifted in Cole's expression. A subtle thing, the particular look of a man who has spent a long time hoping someone would say the right words. There are people, Cole said carefully, men who rode with Billy, men who held to the original code, and who've spent years at the margins of the current club, watching what it became, not happy about it. Men who've been waiting for something to change without knowing what that something would look like. Call them, Ethan said. Cole blinked, almost smiled. You want me to call them? I want you to tell them that Billy Carter's grandson found the box, Ethan said. And I want you to find out which ones show up. Cole reached for his phone. He paused before dialing. Ethan, you understand what you're stepping into. You understand this isn't a simple thing. Victor Kane has been operating for 30 years. He is not going to respond to pressure the way a normal business rival would. This gets complicated fast. I know, Ethan said. And I need to know that you know, Cole said more firmly. I'm not putting men in motion. Men who trust me and who trusted Billy without knowing the person I'm putting them in motion for understands the weight of that. Ethan looked at him steadily. He thought about his grandfather reading the same documents in this same workshop, making the same calculation and making a different choice. The choice to wait, to be careful, to protect his family above all else. He understood that choice completely. He respected it completely. He was also 26 years old with no children and no dependents, with enough mechanical skill to make a living anywhere. With the kind of anger that had been quietly building for 3 months every time he thought about how his grandfather had carried this alone. Cole, he said, Billy lived with this for 30 years. He documented it and organized it and kept it safe, and he waited. I understand why he waited. I'm not going to wait. Cole looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he dialed. The first person he called was a man named Darnell Watson, who picked up immediately. Cole spoke briefly, said Billy's name, said the box, and listened. Then he hung up and said, "He'll be here in an hour." The second call went to a man named Pete Kowalski, who apparently didn't answer his phone before 10 in the morning, and whose voicemail Cole left a message on that said only, "It's Cole, call me back. It's about Billy, it's real." He hung up and said, "Pete'll call back within 20 minutes. The third call was longer. Cole walked to the far end of the workshop and lowered his voice. And Ethan didn't hear the details, but he heard the tone shift about halfway through, heard it go from businesslike to something quieter, something that sounded like emotion, that a man of Cole's particular formation didn't particularly know how to carry in his voice. When Cole came back, his expression was controlled, but something behind his eyes wasn't. "Who was that?" Ethan asked. "Man named Roy Hester," Cole said. He was Billy's closest friend in the chapter. They came up together. Roy left the club 6 months before Billy did. Victor pushed him out first, used Roy as a test to see how much resistance he'd face. He paused. Roy's been carrying a lot of guilt about that, about leaving before Billy did, about not being there at the end of it. What did he say? He said he's been waiting for this call for 22 years. Ethan looked at the workshop door. He thought about Roy Hester waiting 22 years for a phone call. He thought about guilt carried that long, about the specific weight of believing you'd left someone to stand alone who shouldn't have had to. "Tell him Billy didn't blame him," Ethan said. Cole looked at him sharply. "I don't know that for a fact," Ethan said, "but I know my grandfather. And Billy Carter was not a man who carried blame for people making the choices they had to make to survive. Tell Roy that." Cole held his gaze for a moment, then he picked up his phone and sent a brief text. Pete Kowalski called back in 11 minutes. After Cole spoke with him and hung up, he said Pete would be there by noon. Then Cole went quietly, sitting on the stool at the workbench with the open box in front of him, going back through Billy's documents, with the focused attention of a man building a picture in his mind. Ethan made coffee on the small machine Billy had always kept in the corner of the workshop. He brought a cup to Cole and kept one for himself and stood drinking it and thinking. He was thinking about Maria Ortega specifically. He'd never met her, but she was real to him in the way that people in stories become real when the story is your own family's story. He was thinking about what 3 months of mounting pressure felt like to a woman running her father's business without whatever support system might have existed when Billy was still alive. He was thinking about the health inspector citation and the supplier problems and the fire in the storage room that was probably accidental. He was thinking about probably. "Cole," he said. Cole looked up from the documents. "I want to talk to Maria Ortega," Ethan said. Cole set down the folder he was holding. "That's a complicated thing to do right now." "I know, but she deserves to know that someone is paying attention. She's been dealing with this alone for months." He paused. "Whatever else we do, whatever comes next with Victor and the documents and all of it, she deserves to know someone sees what's happening." Cole was quiet for a moment. If we approach her directly, there's a chance it gets back to Victor that someone is moving. He has people in a lot of places. "How long before it gets back to him anyway?" Ethan said. "You called 3 people this morning. Darnell, Pete, Roy. Maybe they told someone. Maybe Victor already knows that Billy's grandson walked into a diner last night wearing the patch." He held Cole's gaze. "You said yourself someone is always watching. I'd rather move than wait to be moved on." Cole studied him. "You sound like him," he said. "I'm going to take that as a good sign," Ethan said. Cole almost smiled again. He was getting closer to it each time. "Fine, I know where the store is. I'll take you." They were almost out the door when Ethan's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered. The voice on the other end was smooth and unhurried and carried the specific kind of pleasantness that people use when they want to sound unthreatening and are counting on you not to notice that they're not. "Is this Ethan Carter?" the voice said. "Who's asking?" "My name isn't important right now," the voice said. "What's important is that we have mutual interests, you and I. I heard you've been asking some questions about history. Old business, the kind of thing that has a way of becoming current business very quickly when people start disturbing it." A pause perfectly timed. "I think it would be worth having a conversation, you and I." before things get complicated. Ethan met Cole's eyes across the workshop. Cole had gone completely still. "I don't know who you are," Ethan said. "No," the voice agreed pleasantly, "but you know my name. You've been hearing it since last night. And I think if you're as intelligent as you appear to be, you understand that I'm extending you a courtesy right now by calling, instead of simply letting events proceed on their own." The call disconnected. Ethan held the phone and looked at Cole. "Victor Kane," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "Or someone calling on his behalf," Ethan said. Cole stood up straight. The easy, measured quality he'd carried since the morning shifted slightly, not into fear, not into alarm, but into the particular sharpness of a man who had always known this moment was coming and was now simply calibrating to it. "He knows," Cole said. "He knows," Ethan agreed, "which means we have significantly less time than I thought we did." Cole looked at the box. "We need to get that to someone safe, today. After we go to the Ortegas," Ethan said. Cole opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Ethan Carter, 26 years old, a mechanic wearing a dead man's jacket that had just attracted the attention of a man who'd spent 30 years making problems disappear. "After we go to the Ortegas," he agreed. Ethan picked up the box and tucked it under one arm and walked out of his grandfather's workshop into the morning, and the jacket moved around his shoulders the way it always did, broken and certain familiar, as a second skin. And for the first time since Billy Carter died, it felt like something more than grief. It felt like purpose. They drove in Cole's truck, the box wedged between Ethan's feet on the passenger side, and neither of them spoke much for the first 10 minutes. The phone call sat between them like a third passenger present, heavy, impossible to ignore. Victor Kane had moved fast, faster than Cole had expected, and Cole Harrison was not a man who expected things slowly. "How did he get my number?" Ethan finally asked. "Victor Kane has been collecting information on people for 30 years, Cole said, eyes on the road. "Your grandfather's name was in an obituary. Your name was in the obituary. You've lived in this county your whole life. Getting your phone number wasn't hard. He called within 12 hours of me walking into that diner." "Which tells you two things," Cole said. "First, he had people in that diner last night, or someone in that diner made a call. Second, he's not waiting to see how this develops. He's moving to get ahead of it." He glanced over. "Victor Kane doesn't make phone calls to people he isn't worried about." Ethan let that land. Victor Kane, 71 years old, 30 years of careful insulation, legitimate business fronts, the kind of man who let other people get their hands dirty while his stayed clean, had personally called a 26-year-old mechanic the morning after that mechanic walked into a diner. Because of a jacket, because of a patch, because of what those things represented to people who understood what they were looking at. "He's scared," Ethan said. Cole was quiet for a beat. "He's careful. There's a difference." "Is there another beat?" "No," Cole admitted. "Not in this case, not if he moved this fast." The Ortega hardware store had been on Clement Street for 4 decades. Roberto Ortega had opened it when he was 28 years old with a loan from his brother-in-law and a belief that a neighborhood hardware store run by someone who actually knew the neighborhood could outlast any chain competitor. He'd been right. The store had survived 3 recessions, 2 highway reroutes that changed traffic patterns on Clement Street, and the general economic churn that had shuttered half the businesses on the block over the years. When Roberto got sick 6 years ago, his daughter Maria had stepped in without being asked, learning the inventory and the suppliers and the accounts and the specific knowledge of what every regular customer needed before they knew they needed it. When Roberto died 4 years ago, Maria had kept it going with the same steady, unflashy competence that had characterized everything her father built. Ethan knew none of this yet. Cole told him in the truck, factually and without embellishment, the way you brief someone on terrain before they walk into it. "Does she know who Billy was?" Ethan asked. "She knows the name," Cole said. "Roberto knew Billy well. They went back decades. Billy was the one who stood between Roberto and a forced property sale back in the early 90s. Roberto told Maria enough that she'd understand the connection, but he passed before Shrezio." Cole stopped, before any of this became relevant again. "So she knows someone named Billy Carter helped her father. She doesn't know her father's store is currently being targeted by the same man Billy spent 30 years building a case against." "Correct." Ethan absorbed that. "This is going to be a hard conversation. Most of the important ones are." Cole parked half a block from the store, and they went in on foot. The bell above the door was the same kind Ethan had heard 100 times in 100 similar stores, light, functional, completely without pretension. The store itself smelled like hardware stores, always smell metal and wood and rubber, and something indefinably practical, the scent of things that work. A woman in her mid-50s was at the counter going over an invoice, and she looked up when they came in with the automatic attentiveness of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading customers at the door. She looked at Ethan, at the jacket. Something flickered in her expression that was gone almost immediately, fast enough that Ethan nearly missed it. She hadn't missed the patch. "Cole Harrison," she said, and her voice was measured in the way of someone managing a reaction rather than the absence of one. "Maria," Cole said, "thank you for the time. This is Ethan Carter." Maria Ortega looked at Ethan directly. She had her father's eyes, Cole had said, and Ethan understood what that meant. Immediately, they were steady, evaluating the eyes of someone who had learned long ago that the world required clear sight and that flinching from what you saw was a luxury you couldn't afford. "Billy's grandson," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. She came out from behind the counter. She didn't extend her hand. Instead, she looked at the patch on the back of the jacket with an expression that wasn't readable as any single emotion. It was layered, complicated, the face of someone encountering a symbol that meant multiple things simultaneously. "I heard Billy passed," she said. "I'm sorry, he was a good man." "Thank you," Ethan said. "He came by here," she said almost to herself. "About 2 years ago, just walked in, said he was in the neighborhood, bought a box of screws he didn't need. We had coffee in the back. He didn't explain why he was here, and I didn't ask." She looked at Ethan. "But I understood. He was checking on us. He never stopped checking on us." Ethan felt the weight of that land squarely in his chest. Maria Cole said, "We need to talk to you about what's been happening. The supplier issues, the inspection. We need you to know that we know and that it isn't random." Something shifted in Maria's face. Not surprise, the specific absence of surprise that comes when someone finally hears confirmed what they'd already understood but hadn't wanted to fully name. "Victor Kane," she said flatly. Cole didn't flinch. "Yes." Maria turned away from them both. She walked the length of the counter and back, not pacing out of anxiety, but moving the way some people need to move when they're containing something large. When she turned back, her jaw was set. "My father knew his name," she said. "Papa told me if that name ever appeared, if anyone connected to that man ever came near this store, I was to call Cole Harrison immediately." She looked at Cole with something that managed to be both accusing and grateful simultaneously. "I didn't call because I didn't know for certain, because nothing has had his name on it directly, because it's all implausibly deniable." "That's how Victor operates," Cole said. "That's by design." "I know it's by design," Maria said with an edge. "I've been running this store for 6 years. I know the difference between a run of bad luck and a coordinated campaign. She stopped. "I didn't know who to call, and I didn't want to believe that it was starting again. Not after 40 years. She looked at the jacket again. "And now here you are wearing Billy Carter's patch, and I want to know what that means." "It means his grandfather left behind something that can stop Kane," Cole said. "Documents. Years of documentation. The kind that doesn't disappear." Maria was quiet. She looked between them, Cole steady and certain. Ethan younger than she'd expected, carrying something in his face that she was trying to identify. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Right now," Ethan said. "I need to know exactly what's happened. Every incident, every visit, every delay, everything you've written off as coincidence or bad luck. I need the complete picture." Maria looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the back of the store and said over her shoulder, "Come on, then." What she told them, sitting at the small table in the storeroom where she and Billy had had coffee 2 years ago, was precise and detailed and delivered in the tone of someone who had been mentally organizing this information for months against the day they might need to report it. The first supplier delay had been in April, 3 weeks after Billy died. She hadn't thought much of it. The second was in May. Then a regular customer who'd been coming in for 15 years told her apologetically that he'd started going elsewhere, that someone had mentioned the store was having quality issues, and he looked uncomfortable enough about saying it that Maria understood immediately that someone had been talking to her customers. The health inspection had been in June. The inspector was professional, cited 3 minor violations. And the violations were real. She'd checked and fixed them, but they were the kind of thing that an inspector had to look hard for. The kind of thing that passed unremarked in 1,000 similar stores. In July, the fire. Small contained ruled accidental. She didn't believe it was accidental. In August, a man in a very clean jacket had come in and offered to buy the building for significantly above market value. He'd represented a company called Meridian Property Group. He'd been polite, professional, and when Maria said no, he'd smiled the specific smile of someone recording an answer they expected to revisit, and he'd left. Meridian Property Group, Cole told Ethan quietly, was a Victor Kane company. Ethan was writing everything down in a small notebook he'd grabbed from his grandfather's workshop. The same brand Billy had always used, spiral-bound college, ruled the kind sold at every drugstore. He wrote quickly, completely, and when Maria finished, he looked at what he'd recorded. The man who came in August, he said. Can you describe him? 50s, medium build, very neat. He had a way of smiling that didn't reach anything above his mouth. Maria paused. His name was Gerald Fitch. Cole went still beside Ethan. Gerald Fitch, Ethan said, writing. You're certain of the name? He gave me a card. I kept it. She got up, went to the front of the store, came back with a business card and set it on the table. Gerald Fitch Business Development. Meridian Property Group. Cole picked it up and turned it over. He said nothing. Cole, Ethan said. Gerald Fitch is in Billy's documents, Cole said carefully. He's been associated with Victor Kane since the late 90s. He's the man who handles the approaches, the initial contact, the offer, the friendly face on the first visit. He set the card back on the table. He's also the man who coordinates the pressure campaign when the initial offer is declined. Maria looked at the card on the table with an expression that had moved from controlled to something more exposed. So everything that's happened since August, she said, was Fitch's coordination, Cole said. Yes, Maria sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. When she looked back down, she had put the controlled expression back, but it cost her something visible. I have employees, she said. 3 full-time, 2 part-time. People who need this store to be open next month and the month after. I've been telling them everything is fine. She paused. Is everything fine? Ethan looked at her directly. Not yet, but we have something that can change it, and we're moving. How fast? She asked. Faster than Victor expects, Ethan said. Maria studied him for a long moment. Then she said something that Ethan didn't expect. You're younger than Billy was when he did this the first time. I know. He was 28. He walked in here and stood between my father and a man who was trying to take everything my father built, and he did it without any drama and without asking for anything in return. She looked at the patch on the jacket where it was visible past Ethan's shoulder. My father used to say Billy Carter was the kind of man the world produces once a generation if it's lucky. Ethan held her gaze. I'm not Billy, he said honestly. No, Maria said, but you're here. They were on their way out when Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, different from the one that had called that morning. 5 words, leave it alone. Last warning. He showed it to Cole on the sidewalk outside the store. Cole read it. His jaw tightened. Second contact in 4 hours, Ethan said. He's escalating. He's measuring your response, Cole said. The first call was to see if you'd panic or negotiate. This is to see if the first call worked. He looked at Ethan. What are you going to do? Ethan put the phone in his pocket. I'm going to go meet Darnell Watson and Pete Kowalski, and then I'm going to find out where Roy Hester is, and then we're going to figure out where these documents need to go to do the most damage in the least time. Cole looked at him for a moment that stretched long enough to be significant. You're not going to respond to him? I'm not going to respond to him, Ethan confirmed. And that was the response, the most effective one available. Not silence out of fear. Silence as message. The message being, I know what I have, I know what I'm doing with it, and you calling me again isn't going to change that. They got back in the truck. Darnell Watson was waiting at Cole's place when they arrived, a big man, late 50s. The kind of physical presence that had softened with age without disappearing, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a coffee and the patient stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that waiting was just time you use for thinking. He looked at Ethan when Cole's truck pulled in, and he said nothing until Ethan was close enough to shake hands. You've got Billy's eyes, Darnell said, not as a compliment or a sentiment, as a statement of observed fact. People keep telling me things like that, Ethan said. They're going to keep doing it, Darnell said. Get used to it. He looked at the jacket and something moved through his expression that was specifically different from what Cole had shown, what Maria had shown. Darnell's reaction was the reaction of a man who had ridden beside Billy Carter and was looking at something he'd believed for 3 months he would never see again. He blinked it away quickly. Cole said, "You found the box." "I found the box." "And you've already talked to Maria Ortega." He looked at Cole. "Fast work." "He moves like Billy," Cole said simply. "He doesn't wait." Pete Kowalski arrived 20 minutes later, driving a truck that had seen harder use than Cole's, a compact Midwestern man with a gray beard and hands that looked like they'd spent their entire adult life in physical work. He was quieter than Darnell, observational, the kind of person who gathered information before he spoke and spoke precisely when he did. He shook Ethan's hand and looked at the documents Cole had laid out on the kitchen table and spent 10 minutes reading in silence before he said anything at all. What he said was, Billy had the Fitch connection documented back to 2003. "I didn't know he had that." "What does that matter?" Ethan asked. "Because in 2003, Gerald Fitch facilitated a property transaction that pushed out a family named Delacroix from a commercial building on the north side. The Delacroix family filed a complaint at the time. Nothing came of it. But if Billy's documentation puts Fitch at that transaction in a different capacity than the official record shows." Pete looked up. "It changes what a prosecutor can do with the 2003 complaint. It reopens it." Ethan looked at Cole. "That's more than one thread." "That's Billy," Cole said. "He never documented one thing at a time. He documented patterns. He understood that individual incidents are deniable, patterns are not." Roy Hester arrived just before noon. They heard his motorcycle before they saw him, an older machine maintained rather than restored, with the sound of something that had been kept alive through attention and care over many years. He was older than Cole, older than Darnell, 70 at least, and he walked with the particular economy of motion of a man who had learned to make every movement count. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the documents on the table and the box beside them, and for a moment he didn't move at all. Then he walked to this table and picked up one of the folders and opened it, and his hands weren't entirely steady. "He never stopped," Roy said. "No," Cole said. "He never stopped." Roy set the folder down and turned to Ethan and looked at him with the specific, complicated gaze of a man encountering his own history in the face of someone young. "Cole gave me your message," Roy said. "What you said about Billy not carrying blame." "I meant it," Ethan said. "You couldn't have known that for certain," Roy said. "Not aggressively, just honestly." "No," Ethan agreed. "But I knew him, and I knew he wasn't built for carrying blame for other people's necessary choices." Roy was quiet for a long moment. "He told me once the last time I saw him before I left, he said, 'Roy, the only person responsible for what I do next is me.' That's it. That's the whole thing." He looked at Ethan. "I've spent 22 years arguing with that sentence in my head and never winning the argument." "Then stop arguing with it," Ethan said. Roy looked at him. Something in his face shifted that was not quite grief and not quite relief, and was some specific combination of both that didn't have a precise name. "Tell me what you need," Roy said. What Ethan needed was what he then laid out for all four of them, standing at Cole's kitchen table with Billy Carter's documents spread in front of them, and the jacket on his shoulders, and the morning's events still raw in the air. The diner, the workshop, Maria Ortega's storeroom. 2 contacts from Victor Kane in 4 hours. He laid it out plainly and without dramatics, the same way his grandfather would have, because it was the only mode he had. They needed the documents with someone who could use them. A specific attorney, not a general practitioner, a specific kind, with the specific combination of criminal law knowledge and appetite for cases that involved organized activity. Cole had a name. Pete confirmed the name independently. That was step 1. They needed to document what was currently happening to the Ortega store in a way that connected to the historical pattern Billy had established. Maria's records, the card from Gerald Fitch, her accounts of each incident cross-referenced with what was in the box. That was step 2. Roy said he'd go back to the store with Ethan that afternoon. Roy had known Maria's father. Maria would trust him. They needed to understand where else Victor's pressure was currently being applied, because the Ortega property wasn't the only situation. Cole had known about one other property on the same street, a family-owned laundromat, the Ewan family, who had been experiencing similar issues since spring. Pete knew of a third. Darnell had heard about a fourth. Victor wasn't working one angle. He was working a corridor. He wanted the whole block. When Ethan understood that, when the full shape of it became clear, he went quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents. He thought about his grandfather, sitting alone in the workshop night after night, building this file, understanding that whatever Victor Kane was doing had a scope beyond any individual victim. He wasn't just protecting the Ortegas, Ethan said. He was documenting a pattern large enough to take down the whole operation. Yes, Cole said. And he never got to use it. No, Ethan's hand was flat on the table on top of the folder nearest to him. He pressed his palm down on it, deliberately consciously, the way you press your hand to something when you are making it real. We're going to use it, he said. Nobody in the room disagreed. They were 40 minutes into planning the next steps when Cole's phone rang. He looked at it, and his expression changed in a way that made everyone in the room go quiet before he even answered. He put it on speaker. The voice was not Victor Kane. It was younger, flatter, with the specific tonelessness of someone delivering a message rather than having a conversation. Cole Harrison, you have until 6 o'clock this evening to return the Carter documents to Meridian Property Group or surrender them to the fire. A pause. After 6, we stop asking. Cole ended the call. The silence in the room was the particular silence of 5 people recalibrating in real time. Ethan picked up the box. Then we have until 6, he said, to make sure those documents are somewhere he can't touch them. He looked at Cole. Call the attorney, right now, not to make an appointment, to tell him we're coming today. Cole was already dialing. Darnell stood up from the table. I'll drive separately. If someone's watching this place, splitting up is smarter. Someone is watching this place, Pete said flatly. Count on it. Roy looked at Ethan across the table. Ethan looked back. He thought about what 6 o'clock meant, the manufactured urgency of it, the deadline designed to create panic and bad decisions, the oldest pressure tactic available. He thought about Billy Carter building 30 years of documentation with the patience of a man who had decided that urgency was a trap that other people fell into. He thought about the Ortega store, the UN family laundromat, 2 more families he didn't know yet but whose situations were real and immediate. He thought about Gerald Fitch's smile that didn't reach anything above his mouth. He thought about his grandfather's letter. The jacket was not a symbol of power. It was a reminder of responsibility. We don't panic, Ethan said to the room. We don't rush into mistakes. We move deliberately, and we move now, and we don't give Victor Kane the satisfaction of knowing his deadline scared us. He looked at each of them in turn. We get these documents to the attorney. Today. And then tomorrow we start building the rest of it. He had the jacket on. He had the box under his arm. He had 4 men in a room who had waited 22 years for something to change, and were now standing up because it was. What he didn't have yet was any idea that Victor Kane had already made a move none of them had anticipated. He would find that out in the next 3 hours, and when he did, the entire calculation was going to change. The move Victor Kane had already made became clear when Ethan's phone rang 40 minutes into the drive across town. It was his mother. He almost didn't answer. He was running through logistics in his head, the attorney's office, the documents, what needed to happen before 6 o'clock. And he was in Cole's truck with Roy following behind and Pete and Darnell splitting off separately, and his mind was moving at the specific velocity of someone managing multiple urgent things simultaneously. But his mother's name on the screen had a pull that cut through all of it, because Sandra Carter did not call in the middle of the day without a reason, and she had not called him once during business hours in the 3 months since Billy died without something prompting it. He answered, Mom. Ethan. Her voice had a quality he recognized and didn't like carefully level the specific flatness of someone controlling something underneath the surface. There are 2 men sitting in a car outside the house. They've been there for about an hour. I noticed because Mrs. Garfield from next door came over and asked if everything was okay. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. Are they doing anything? He asked. Sitting, his mother said. Just sitting? But Ethan, one of them, got out a few minutes ago and walked to the mailbox. He wasn't checking the mail. He was making sure I could see him. Victor Kane wasn't threatening Sandra Carter. He was informing her that he knew she existed. That was the move, precise, deniable, completely effective. You didn't have to say a word to a person's family. You simply made your presence visible and let the imagination do the rest. Ethan kept his voice calm with an effort. Mom, I need you to go to Aunt Patrice's right now. Don't explain, just say you want company. Take your overnight bag. Do it in the next 10 minutes. Silence on the line for a moment. His mother was 61 years old, and she was not a woman who was easily rattled, but she was also not a woman who had been raised in ignorance of the world. She had known all her life that her father carried something he didn't discuss. She had filed it in the category of things she'd learned not to pull at. "How serious is this?" she asked quietly. "Serious enough that I need you not at home tonight," Ethan said. "I'll explain everything when I can. Right now, I just need you to move." "Okay," she said. Just okay, no argument, no further questions, and that single word delivered with that particular steady trust hit Ethan harder than almost anything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He thought about what it meant to have a parent who believed in you that completely. "I love you," he said. "Go." He hung up and looked at Cole. Cole had heard enough of it to understand. His expression had gone flat in the way of a man running calculations he didn't like. "He went for your family," Cole said. "He went for my mother," Ethan said, "to make me feel it personally, to give me something to lose beyond principle." He paused. "It won't work the way he thinks it will." "Are you sure about that?" Ethan thought about his mother picking up her overnight bag in the next 10 minutes, driving to her sister's, not knowing the full shape of what her son had walked into. He thought about the specific kind of fury that it produces, not panic, but clarity. "It makes me want to move faster," Ethan said. "Not slower." Cole nodded once. He drove. The attorney's name was James Whitfield, and Cole had reached him on the phone during the drive, not the scheduled appointment he'd mentioned that morning, but the urgent version, the one where Cole had said, "We have documented evidence of 30 years of organized coercion, and we need to be in your office today." Whitfield had said, "Be here at 2." It was 1:43 when Cole's truck pulled into the parking structure near Whitfield's building. Roy was right behind them. They went up together, the four of them, Cole, Ethan, Roy, and Darnell, who had parked separately and come in through a different entrance, because Darnell Watson had been in enough complicated situations in his life to understand that entrances and exits were worth thinking about. Pete Kowalski was at the Ortega store with Maria doing what Ethan had asked, sitting with her records, cross-referencing dates, building the current documented picture to overlay with Billy's historical one. James Whitfield was a lean man in his early 60s with the sharp, unhurried intelligence of someone who had spent decades learning to see the precise outline of things other people kept deliberately blurry. He shook Ethan's hand, looked at the jacket for exactly half a second in a way that was professional rather than personal, and then looked at the box under Ethan's arm with the focused attention of a man identifying something significant. "Set it on the table," he said. "Let's see what 30 years of patience looks like." What it looked like spread across Whitfield's conference table over the next 40 minutes was comprehensive in a way that even Cole hadn't fully appreciated until he watched an attorney with 30 years of his own experience react to it. Whitfield went through the folders, methodically pausing at specific documents, asking precise questions, occasionally making a note on the yellow legal pad beside him. He didn't editorialize. He didn't perform surprise. He simply worked through the material with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and found it. When he finished, he put down his pen and sat back and looked at Ethan. "Your grandfather," he said, "was either a very careful man or a very lucky one." "He was a very careful man," Ethan said. "He documented 6 separate incidents of what amounts to coordinated property coercion across a 12-year period. He has corroborated records for 4 of them, meaning he has more than his own account. He has secondary sources, dated correspondence, in one case a recorded conversation." Whitfield paused. "He also has what appears to be the financial trail, connecting those incidents to a single coordinating entity, Meridian Property Group, predating Meridian's official incorporation by 3 years." The room was quiet. "What does that mean?" Roy asked. "It means the operation existed before the corporate structure existed," Whitfield said, "which means the corporate structure was built to provide cover for an operation already in progress. Which is, from an evidentiary standpoint, substantially more damning than an operation that grew out of a legitimately formed business." He looked at Ethan. "This is the kind of documentation that doesn't just support individual complaints. It supports a pattern of racketeering under federal statute." Ethan felt the weight of that word land in the room. "RICO," Cole said quietly. "Potentially," Whitfield said carefully. "I'm not going to tell you it's certain because nothing in law is certain before it's adjudicated. But what I can tell you is that this documentation, properly filed and properly presented, opens an investigative door that has been closed for 30 years. He looked at Ethan directly. It also means the person who sits on top of this operation will know within hours of any filing that the door is open. And depending on that person's resources and risk tolerance, that creates a window of elevated danger between now and when the investigation has enough official momentum to provide protection. We already have a 6 o'clock deadline, Ethan said. He called this morning and told us to return the documents or destroy them. Whitfield looked at him without surprise. Then he already knows you have them, and he's already in motion. He picked up his pen. I'm going to make 2 calls right now. One to a federal contact who handles organized crime complaints. One to a colleague in the district attorney's office who I have reason to believe has been looking at Meridian Property Group independently without enough to move on. He met Ethan's eyes. Your grandfather's documentation may be the piece that connects 2 separate ongoing inquiries into something actionable. Make the calls, Ethan said. Whitfield made them in a separate room. While he was gone, the 4 of them sat around the conference table in a silence that had weight and substance and the specific quality of people who have been moving fast and have arrived briefly at a still point. Roy was looking at his hands. Darnell was looking at the documents still spread on the table. Cole was looking at Ethan. You're handling this well, Cole said. Not a compliment exactly, an observation. I don't feel like I'm handling it well, Ethan said honestly. I feel like I'm running about 3 minutes ahead of something large and not looking back. That's what handling it well looks like from the inside, Darnell said without looking up from the documents. The people who look calm on the outside feel exactly like that. Roy looked up. Billy used to say the same thing. He paused. He said the only difference between courage and panic is which direction you run. Ethan thought about that. Whitfield came back in 22 minutes. He sat down and folded his hands on the table and spoke in the flat, precise way of a man who has received significant information and is choosing to deliver it cleanly. The federal contact confirmed there is an active inquiry into Meridian Property Group that began 14 months ago following a complaint from the UN family. He paused. They have been building a case but have lacked corroborated historical documentation that establishes the pattern predating Meridian's incorporation. He looked at the box. What's in that box is exactly the missing piece. My contact wants to meet with us before 6 o'clock today. Cole exhaled, not loudly, just a controlled, sustained breath of someone releasing pressure. In the DA's office, Ethan asked. More complicated, Whitfield said. My colleague has been aware of Meridian for 2 years. He has not moved because the case he has is circumstantial, strong suspicion, insufficient documentation. Billy's records changed that calculus significantly. He paused. But he also told me something that changes the picture in a way I need you all to hear carefully. He looked around the table. Gerald Fitch turned state's evidence 8 months ago, Whitfield said. He has been cooperating with the federal inquiry since October of last year. His cooperation has been kept completely confidential. Victor Kane does not know that Gerald Fitch is working with federal investigators. The silence that followed this had a completely different quality from the silence before. This was the silence of a room full of people absorbing information that redraws the entire map. Ethan was the first one to speak. The man Kane is using to run his pressure campaigns, he said slowly, has been feeding information to the people investigating him for 8 months. Yes, Whitfield said, and Kane doesn't know. No. Ethan sat back. He thought about Gerald Fitch walking into Maria Ortega's store in August with his professional smile and his business card and his offer that was really a warning. He thought about Fitch filing a report about that visit to a federal investigator that same week. He thought about the layered, complex nature of a situation that had been developing in multiple directions simultaneously without any of the people involved knowing the full shape of it. He thought about his grandfather building documentation for 30 years with the patient understanding that the right moment would come. The right moment had been building on its own from another direction without Billy ever knowing. Billy didn't know about Fitch, Ethan said. No way he could have, Cole said. But his documentation corroborates everything Fitch has been saying, Ethan said, from a completely independent source, spanning 30 years instead of 8 months. He looked at Whitfield. That's not just a missing piece. That's a wall. Whitfield allowed himself a brief, controlled expression of agreement. It substantially alters the prosecutorial picture, yes, Roy said very quietly. Billy won, he just didn't know it yet. The room absorbed that. Shit. Ethan looked at the box, at the folders that Billy Carter had organized and maintained and kept in a lockbox under a nail in a workshop for 30 years waiting. He thought about his grandfather driving to the Ortega store 2 years ago, buying screws he didn't need, drinking coffee, with Maria checking on a promise he'd made decades earlier, still watching, still paying attention, still carrying it. He thought about the jacket, not a symbol of power, a reminder of responsibility. "When can we meet the federal contact?" he asked Whitfield. 4:30, Whitfield said. "At this office. I'll need the original documents to remain here in my custody between now and then." "Done," Ethan said. "What?" "There's one more thing," Whitfield said. He spoke carefully. "The 6 o'clock deadline Kane issued, and I'm going to assume you've communicated this situation accurately to me, constitutes an explicit threat to destroy evidence and is itself a criminal act. If you're willing to provide a sworn statement about the contact you received, that call becomes part of the federal file." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Write up the statement." Cole looked at him. "That puts you directly in Kane's line of sight." "I'm already in his line of sight," Ethan said. "He called my personal phone this morning and had men outside my mother's house before noon. The only thing that changes when I give that statement is that he knows I'm not afraid of him knowing." He met Cole's gaze steadily, which is exactly what I want him to know. The statement took 30 minutes to write, review, and sign. While Ethan was doing that, Cole stepped out and called Pete Kowalski at the Ortega store. Pete reported that he and Maria had built a clean chronological record of every incident since April dates descriptions, the Fitch card, the fire marshal report, the health inspection, citation, everything. Cole told him to bring it to Whitfield's office before 4:30. Pete didn't ask questions. He said he'd be there. While Cole was on the phone, Roy pulled Ethan aside in the hallway outside the conference room. The older man looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has been holding something back and has decided the time for holding back is over. "I need to tell you something," Roy said. "Okay," Ethan said. When Victor pushed me out before Billy walked, I didn't just leave quietly. I went to Victor. I told him I wasn't going to make trouble. I told him I understood the new direction and I wasn't going to fight it." Roy's jaw worked. "I did it to protect myself, my family. I had a wife and 2 kids, and I told myself it was the only realistic option." He paused. Victor took that conversation and used it. He used it to pressure 2 other men who might have stood with Billy, told them Roy Hester made his peace with the program and they should do the same. Both of those men backed down. If they'd stood with Billy— "Stop," Ethan said. Roy looked at him. "You made the choice you had to make to keep your family safe," Ethan said. "My grandfather understood that, and Victor Kane used your words to manipulate other people. That's on Victor Kane, not on you. You didn't make those men back down. He did." Ethan held the older man's gaze. "You're here now. That's what matters." Roy looked at him for a long moment. "You really are Billy's grandson," he said. He said it differently from how Cole had said it, how Maria had said it. He said it with the specific weight of a man who had known Billy Carter when Billy Carter was young, who had seen in that young man the same quality he was now seeing reproduced in someone else, undiminished by the generation between them. "I'm going to take that as the best thing anyone said to me this week," Ethan said. Roy almost smiled. It was the first time Ethan had seen him come close. The federal meeting at 4:30 brought 2 people. Ethan hadn't expected. The federal contact Whitfield had called a composed woman named Agent Reyes, who handled organized crime cases with the efficient, unhurried manner of someone completely comfortable with complexity, and a second agent who arrived 5 minutes after her, and whose presence told Ethan that Whitfield's call had moved up a chain faster than anyone had anticipated. Agent Reyes went through Billy's documents the way Whitfield had methodically, completely without performance. When she finished, she looked at Ethan with an expression that was professional, but contained underneath it something that was unmistakably respect. "Your grandfather built a clean file," she said. "He was a careful man," Ethan said. "This corroborates 43 specific claims that Gerald Fitch has made in 8 months of cooperation," she said, "from an independent source spanning 3 decades. This is not a small thing, Mr. Carter." She paused. "I want to be honest with you about what happens next because you deserve to understand it before we move forward." "Please," Ethan said. "When we file, Kane will know within hours. He has enough access to enough information systems that we cannot prevent that. And between filing and the formal protective scaffolding of an active federal investigation going public, there is a window. It's short, we're talking 24 to 48 hours, but it's real. She met his eyes. During that window, Kane's response is unpredictable. He is 71 years old, and he is looking at the end of everything he built. I understand, Ethan said. I need to know that you and the people you've brought into this are prepared for that window, she said. Ethan looked around the room. Roy Darnell, Pete Kowalski, who had arrived at 4:15 with Maria Ortega's documentation, and Maria herself, who had come with Pete, and was sitting at the far end of the table with the set expression of someone who has decided they are done being afraid. We're prepared, he said. There's something else, Agent Reyes said. She looked at him carefully. Gerald Fitch and his cooperation has provided us with information about multiple former and current club members who operated under Kane's direction. Some of those people have potential liability exposure. Others were coerced into cooperation with Kane over years and have potential cooperating witness status themselves. She paused. Fitch specifically named 3 men in his testimony who he believed maintained the original code men who resisted Kane's direction even under pressure, and whose resistance Kane worked around rather than through. Cole had gone very still. He named Billy Carter first, Agent Reyes said. He named Cole Harrison second. She looked at Roy, and he named Roy Hester third. The silence in the room had a quality Ethan couldn't name precisely. It was the silence of people hearing something that reorganizes years of belief about their own history. Roy Hester put one hand flat on the conference table and stared at it. Fitch knew, Roy said. It wasn't a question. Fitch was there, Agent Reyes said quietly. He saw what happened. He saw who resisted and who complied and who was coerced. He's been carrying that knowledge for 8 months, and he put it in the record. She paused. The record says Roy Hester was pressured out of the chapter under threat to his family, and that his subsequent statement to Kane was made under duress. The record says that clearly. Roy's hand was still flat on the table. His shoulders were doing something that a younger man might have tried to control, and that Roy at his age simply allowed to happen. Darnell put a hand on Roy's shoulder and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Ethan watched Roy Hester absorb 22 years of weight being lifted by 8 words from a man he'd never liked Fitch knew, and he thought about the complicated, non-linear way that justice actually moved through the world. Not in clean arcs, in long, tangled threads that came together in conference rooms decades after the original events in ways nobody had planned. He thought about his grandfather. He thought, Billy, you didn't win alone. You never knew how much company you had. They were wrapping up the meeting. Whitfield was talking to Agent Reyes about the filing timeline. Pete was organizing his copy of Maria's records. Cole was on the phone with someone Ethan didn't know. When Ethan stepped into the hallway and found Maria Ortega there standing alone, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that had come unguarded now that she was out of the conference room. You okay? He asked. She looked at him. My father used to pray every Sunday for 40 years, she said. He was specific about it. He prayed for the people who'd helped him and for the situation to resolve before he died. She paused. He died without seeing it resolve. He died thinking Billy had died without it resolving. She met Ethan's eyes. And here we are. Here we are, Ethan said. Maria looked at the jacket, at the patch, at the thing that had started all of this, a piece of leather and thread that had been hanging on a nail in a workshop, waiting for someone to put it on and walk into the right room at the wrong time of night. Your grandfather would be furious, you know, she said with the first smile he'd seen from her. All of this happening in one day. He'd say you were being reckless. Probably, Ethan said. But he'd be proud, Maria said, and the smile stayed even as her eyes got briefly bright. He'd be so proud he wouldn't know what to do with himself. They went back into the conference room. Cole had ended his phone call and was standing at the head of the table with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man who has received news that takes a moment to calibrate. What? Ethan said. Cole looked at him steadily. That was a man named Marcus Webb. He rode with Billy's chapter for 4 years before Victor's people pushed him out. He heard from someone who heard from someone that things were moving. He paused. He wants to come. Then tell him to come, Ethan said. He's not the only one, Cole said. Marcus has been talking to people. There are 6 men who've been waiting, some of them for 20 years, for something to actually happen. Not just talk. Something real. He held Ethan's gaze. They want to know if this is real. Tell them it's real, Ethan said. They're going to want to hear it from you, Cole said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about 6 men he'd never met who had been sitting with the same weight Roy Hester had been sitting with, the particular burden of people who'd held to something when it cost them and had never gotten to see that holding matter. Set it up, he said, tonight, after the filing timeline is confirmed. I want everyone who was part of what Billy built to know that it's not just documented, it's moving. Cole pulled out his phone. That's going to be a significant gathering. Good, Ethan said. The filing was confirmed for 7 a.m. the following morning. Agent Reyes said it clearly, and without hedge, by noon tomorrow, Victor Kane would know that a federal complaint had been filed, incorporating 30 years of corroborated documentation from an independent source. By noon tomorrow, the window would be open. And 20 minutes after Reyes gave them that timeline, Ethan's phone lit up with a text from a number he'd seen once before. It was the same number that had sent the 5-word message that morning. Leave it alone. Last warning. The new message was 3 words. You made a mistake. Ethan read it. He turned the phone so Cole could see it. Cole read it. Then Ethan put the phone face down on the conference table and looked at Agent Reyes. He knows we talked to you, Ethan said. Reyes looked at the phone. Her expression didn't change significantly, but something behind her eyes sharpened. We assumed he would find out quickly. This is faster than anticipated. She looked at Ethan. This actually helps us. Direct contact after we've opened an inquiry is documented interference. It goes in the file. I know, Ethan said. He was already writing it down in the same spiral-bound notebook he'd been carrying all day. Date, time, exact text, the same way Billy would have done it. Cole watched him write and didn't say anything. When Ethan looked up, Cole was looking at him with an expression that Ethan had seen building all day since the workshop that morning, since the diner the night before, accumulating with each hour of events, an expression that was specific and clear, and that Ethan understood without needing it explained. It was the expression of a man recognizing someone, not recognizing Ethan Carter, 26 mechanic, recognizing something that ran deeper than one person, something that had been passed along a line through a workshop and a box and a letter and a jacket and 30 years of patient, documented, careful work, and had arrived intact in exactly the form it needed to arrive in. He said you made a mistake, Cole said quietly. Ethan looked at the phone, at the message. He thought about his grandfather, about Roy Hester's hand on the conference table, about Maria Ortega's father praying for 40 years in a church on Sunday, about the Ewan family and whoever the 3rd and 4th families were, about Gerald Fitch telling the truth to federal agents for 8 months from inside the operation he'd helped run, carrying a weight of his own that had finally gotten too heavy to carry. He picked up the notebook. He wrote 3 more words under the text transcription. He hasn't yet. He closed the notebook. Let's go meet those 6 men, he said. The 6 men were waiting at Roy Hester's place, a house on the edge of town that Roy had owned for 30 years, the kind of place that had absorbed decades of living without being changed much by any of it. They were sitting in the kitchen in the adjoining room when Ethan arrived with Cole and Roy, and they stood when the 3 of them came through the door, not out of ceremony, but out of the instinctive, physical acknowledgement of people who understood that something significant was happening and wanted their bodies to register that understanding. Ethan knew none of their names yet. He learned them one by one over the next 10 minutes. Marcus Webb, who had called Cole that afternoon, a quiet man named Dennis Farrow, who had the careful eyes of someone who had spent years watching situations from the edges, 2 brothers named Calvin and Jerome Tate, who had ridden with Billy's chapter for 6 years before Victor's consolidation pushed them to the margins. A former mechanic named Strickland, first name Lou, who looked at Ethan's hands when they shook and said, "You work with your hands," and Ethan said, "Yes, garage," and Lou nodded with the specific recognition of a man who respected that answer above most others. And last, standing slightly apart from the group near the far wall, a man named Arthur Gaines, who was the oldest person in the room by several years, and who had known Billy Carter longer than anyone present except Roy. Arthur Gaines looked at Ethan for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice was the voice of someone who had learned through long experience to make every sentence carry exactly its intended weight and nothing extra. "I knew your grandfather when he was younger than you are right now," Arthur said. "I watched him become the man he became. I watched him make the decision he made when he walked away from Victor Kane, and I watched what it cost him and I watched him carry that cost without complaint for 30 years. He paused. And then I heard this morning that his grandson walked into a diner wearing his patch and had a box of documents in his grandfather's workshop in a federal filing happening at 7 tomorrow morning. He held Ethan's gaze. I need to know who I'm looking at. Are you Billy's grandson who found something, or are you someone who understands what he found? The room was completely quiet. Ethan held the older man's gaze without flinching. Both, he said. I found it because I'm his grandson. I understand it because of who he raised my mother to be and who she raised me to be. He paused. And I understand that what he built was never supposed to end with him. He built it to be used. He kept the jacket because the jacket was supposed to go somewhere. I'm just the person it went to. Arthur Gaines looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he sat down. All right, he said, tell us where we are. Ethan told them, all of it in the same plain direct sequence he had been using all day. The diner, the workshop, the box Billy's letter, the Ortegas, the federal meeting, Fitch's cooperation, the filing timeline, the text from Kane. He didn't editorialize, and he didn't perform confidence. He didn't feel. He laid out the facts in the order they'd happened and let the room absorb them. When he finished, Marcus Webb, who had the restless energy of a man who processed things by moving, stood up from where he'd been leaning against the wall and said, Kane is going to move tonight. You understand that. Whatever he's going to do before that 7 a.m. filing, he's going to do it in the next 12 hours. I know, Ethan said. Which means the Ortega store, Dennis Farrow said quietly from his chair. That's his most exposed current operation. If he's going to send a message before this goes federal, that's where he sends it. Ethan had already thought about this in the truck on the way over. He'd thought about Maria Ortega closing up the store tonight, turning off the lights, going home to a situation she'd been managing alone for months. He'd thought about the window between now and 7 a.m. and what a man like Victor Kane did with windows. Maria needs to not be at the store tonight, Ethan said, and the store needs to not be empty. I'll go, Lou Strickland said immediately. I'll go with him, Calvin Tate said. Jerome beside him nodded without being asked. I'm calling Maria right now, Pete Kowalski said from the corner. Ethan hadn't realized Pete had come with them from Whitfield's office, but Pete had quietly and without announcement, which was Pete's way of doing most things. Pete stepped out to make the call. The room continued its low-focus conversation logistics positions, who was where and when, the specific practical language of people who had spent their lives navigating situations that required coordination without margin for error. Ethan listened and contributed and watched the dynamic of the room find its own organization. The way groups of competent people always do when the situation is clear enough and the stakes are high enough to cut through everything else. Roy Hester was quieter than the others. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and contributed when he had something specific to add, and mostly he watched Ethan with an expression that had been changing all evening, the grief and the guilt steadily alchemizing into something that looked more like purpose. Cole Harrison was on the phone in the hallway. Ethan could hear his tone without hearing his words. Sirius measured the tone of a man managing information outward to people who needed it. Pete came back in. Maria's not going home, he said. She's going to stay at her sister's place tonight. She's leaving her store manager, a man named Roderick, with keys and instructions to call her if anything happens. He paused. I told her not to do that, told her Roderick shouldn't be there alone. What did she say? Ethan asked. Pete's expression shifted. She said Roderick is 63 years old and has worked at that store for 21 years, and she is not going to tell him to leave without explaining why, and she is not ready to explain why to her employees yet because she doesn't want them to panic. He met Ethan's eyes. She said she trusts us to make sure nothing happens to him. The room absorbed that the specific weight of someone's trust delivered without drama. Lou Calvin Jerome, Ethan said. Can you be at that store in the next 30 minutes? 20, Wemo, Lou said, already standing. They left. The room reconfigured around their absence, smaller now but no less focused. Arthur Gaines spoke again from his chair. He'd been sitting with his hands folded on his knee, listening to all of it with the particular quality of attention that very old men develop, complete, unhurried gathering, everything. Victor Kane is 71, Arthur said. I've known him since he was 40, and he was already who he is. A man like that looking at a federal filing at 7 in the morning, he's not going to run. He's too old to run and too proud, and he doesn't believe in the reality of losing even now. What he's going to do is try to take something with him. He paused. Not a building, not a property. He's going to try to take something that matters to the people who moved against him. He's going to try to make it personal. He already tried that with my mother this morning, Ethan said. Your mother is at your aunt's place, Arthur said. He knows that by now. That avenue closed. He looked at Ethan steadily. The thing that matters most visibly to the people in this room, the thing that connects all of us, is that jacket you're wearing. The room went quiet in a specific way. Ethan understood what Arthur was saying. The jacket was a symbol. It had been a symbol from the moment he walked into the diner, the thing that stopped the room, the thing Victor Kane had identified as a threat, the thing that had organized everyone in this situation around a common point of meaning. Symbols had power, and powerful men who were losing sometimes went after the symbol when they couldn't get to anything else. You think he's going to come after the jacket, Ethan said. I think he's going to come after the person wearing it, Arthur said. Or arrange for someone else to. Cole came back into the room. He'd heard the last of it from the doorway, and his expression confirmed that he'd arrived at the same place. I just spoke with Agent Reyes, Cole said. She's aware of the timeline pressure. She's pushing for protective coverage on key individuals tonight, but federal resources at this hour with a filing that isn't technically active yet. He stopped. She's doing what she can. It may not be immediate. So we're managing tonight ourselves, Ethan said. We've managed worse, Dennis Farrow said quietly and without bravado. It was a statement of fact from a man who had a personal accounting of worse situations that he kept private. Ethan looked at the room. He thought about what Victor Kane was doing right now, somewhere in the city, in a clean office or a well-appointed home, a 71-year-old man watching 30 years of construction developing its first serious cracks. He thought about the specific psychology of that, the particular desperation of someone who had built everything on control, looking at a situation that was leaving his control for the first time. Desperate people were dangerous. He knew that. But desperate people also made mistakes. His phone rang, not a text this time. A call. The same number that had sent the 3-word text 2 hours ago. The room stilled. Ethan answered and put it on speaker without hesitating. Mr. Carter. Victor Kane's voice was the same as it had been that morning, smooth, unhurried, carefully pleasant. But something underneath the surface had changed. Something that Ethan could hear clearly now that he'd had hours to calibrate to the particular frequency of Kane's self-presentation. The pleasantness was costing more than it had this morning. It was working harder to cover something. Mr. Kane, Ethan said. A brief pause, barely the second, but Ethan caught it. Kane hadn't expected his name to be used that directly. I understand you had a productive afternoon, Kane said. Meetings with attorneys, federal contacts. Very busy for a young mechanic who only came into this 2 days ago. Another brief pause. I want you to think very carefully about what you've set in motion. Not for your sake, I think you've made your position clear, but for the people around you who may not fully understand the cost of the position they've put themselves in by associating with this situation. The people around me understand exactly what they've put themselves in, Ethan said. They've been waiting to put themselves in it for 20 years. A silence this time that was longer and had a different quality. Your grandfather, Kane said, was a man I respected even when we disagreed. He operated by a code. I understood that code even when I opposed it. You're operating by emotion. That's a significant difference. His voice had dropped slightly, not threatening, something more calculated than threatening. Emotion is not a strategy, Mr. Carter. You're right, Ethan said. The strategy is 30 years of documented evidence filed with federal investigators at 7 tomorrow morning. The emotion is just what I feel while I watch it work. Cole Harrison put one hand flat on the wall beside him and looked at the floor and breathed through his nose. Kane was quiet for 4 full seconds. I hope, he said finally, and the pleasantness was completely gone now, stripped away like a veneer under heat, that you sleep well tonight. The call ended. The room exhaled collectively. Arthur Gaines said without moving from his chair, he's already made his move. That call was to buy time while something else happened. Ethan was already texting Lou Strickland, status. The response came in 40 seconds. We're here. Store is locked. Roderick went home. Maria called him direct and told him to take the night. We're outside. Ethan showed the text to Cole. Cole read it and something in his shoulders dropped slightly with relief. Good yaw, he said. What about the other properties? Dennis Farrow said. Ewan's laundromat, the 2 others. Bah. It was a real question, and nobody in the room had an immediate answer. They had been moving fast all day, with the Ortega situation as the focal point, and the broader network of Victor's current pressure campaign had stayed peripheral. Ethan looked at Pete Kowalski, who had the most comprehensive picture of the other properties from the research he'd done. Ewan's on Clement, 2 blocks from the Ortega store, Pete said. The other 2 are on the same corridor but further north. Henderson's auto parts families had it for 50 years. Mira Castillo's flower shop. He paused. Agent Reyes has addresses for all 4 properties in the file we gave her. Does she have people at any of them tonight? Ethan asked. She said she'd do what she could, Cole repeated, with the tone of a man who knew exactly how much weight that phrase could carry and what its limits were. Marcus Webb stood up. I know where Henderson's is. I've bought parts there for 15 years. He looked at Jerome Tate. Jerome was already on his feet. Mira Castillo, Arthur Gaines said from his chair. I know Mira. Her mother and my late wife went to the same church for 30 years. He pushed himself up with the deliberate care of a man who knew his body's limits and refused to be managed by them. I'll go. Dennis Farrow said, I'll drive him. The room was emptying by action rather than instruction. Each person moving to the place they were most useful because they understood the situation clearly enough to identify that place themselves. Ethan watched it happen and felt something move through him that was neither pride nor relief, but some specific combination of both the feeling of seeing people who had been waiting for a long time do the thing they'd been waiting to do. Cole stayed, Roy stayed, Pete stayed, and then Roy said something that stopped the room. Before everyone goes, Roy said. He was standing at the kitchen table and he had the particular stance of a man who is about to say something that has taken him significant effort to arrive at. I want to say something to Ethan that I should have said hours ago. Ethan looked at him. When Cole called with me this morning and said it was about Billy, I almost didn't come, Roy said. I almost let it go to voicemail the way I have been letting things go for 20 years. I've been living in a very small version of my own life because I told myself the larger version wasn't available to me anymore, that I'd made my choice and this was what was left. He looked at Ethan steadily. You showed up in one day and made that feel like the lie it always was. He stopped. I don't have a better way to say it than that, thank you. Ethan didn't have an immediate answer. He thought about Roy Hester on the phone at 7:43 this morning, saying he'd been waiting 22 years for this call. He thought about the specific loneliness of people who hold to something when it costs them, and then live with the long silence afterward, not knowing if the holding mattered. Roy, he said, you showed up. That's the whole thing. That's what Billy always said. You told me yourself the only difference between courage and panic is which direction you run. He met the older man's eyes. You ran the right direction this morning. Roy turned away for a moment. When he turned back, his face was composed again, or as composed as it was going to get. Let's make sure nothing happens to those stores tonight, Roy said. It was a long night. Not because anything catastrophic happened. It didn't. Lou Strickland and Calvin and Jerome sat outside the Ortega store, and nothing came at it, which meant either Victor Kane had decided the store wasn't his move, or the visible presence of people who clearly weren't afraid of being seen had been deterrent enough. Marcus and Jerome Tate covered Henderson's auto parts and reported nothing. Arthur Gaines sat with Mira Castillo, who turned out to know exactly what was happening to her flower shop, and had been dealing with it in the specific silent dignity of a woman who doesn't panic, but also doesn't lie to herself, and the night passed without incident there too. The federal filing happened at 7:03 a.m. Cole called Ethan at 7:12 to confirm. Ethan was at his Uncle Ray's garage. By then he'd gone in early before the filing, because he needed to do something with his hands, and because Ray, who had been watching his nephew for 3 months and had the good sense not to ask questions until questions were appropriate, had given him a truck engine to rebuild and left him alone with it. Ethan had his hands inside the engine when Cole called, and he stepped back and answered with the hand that wasn't greasy. It's filed, Cole said. Reyes confirmed. Ethan leaned against the side of the truck. He took one slow breath. Okay, he said. Kane's attorney contacted the federal office at 7:30, Cole continued. Kane is cooperating. Cole paused, and something in his voice told Ethan the next sentence was significant. He's not fighting it, Ethan. His attorney is already in conversation about terms. 30 years of building, and he's not fighting it. Ethan absorbed that. He thought about Arthur Gaines saying Victor Kane was too old to run and too proud and didn't believe in the reality of losing. He thought about what it meant that Victor Kane was in fact folding, not fighting, not escalating, but folding. It was the specific collapse of a man who had always known, somewhere underneath the 30 years of construction, that the foundation wasn't what he'd told himself it was. It was the collapse that comes when the story you've built about yourself meets something true. What happens to the properties, Ethan asked. The Ortegas, the others. Meridian's operations are frozen as part of the inquiry, Cole said. The pressure stops today. The outstanding offers are void. Anyone under a current coercive arrangement has legal protection as of this morning. A brief pause. Maria called me 20 minutes ago. She was crying, the good kind. Ethan put his back against the truck and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about Roberto Ortega praying for 40 years. He thought about Maria saying he died without seeing it resolve. He thought it resolved Roberto. It just took a little longer than you had. Cole, he said, is there a chance the men who were coerced into working with Kane, the ones Fitch named in his testimony, is there a chance they get protection? Reyes said the cooperation agreements are being reviewed on a case-by-case basis, Cole said. People who operated under documented coercion are in a significantly better position than people who made free choices. She was specific about that. Good, Ethan said. He went back to the engine. Ray came in an hour later, saw where Ethan was in the rebuild, and handed him a coffee without comment. They worked side by side for a while in the particular comfortable silence of two people who understood each other well enough to not need words. Then Ray said, without looking up from what he was doing, "You want to tell me what happened this week?" Ethan considered it. He thought about how to compress the last 48 hours into something that made sense delivered over an engine in a garage. "I found out who Grandpa Billy was," he said. "The parts we didn't know." Ray was quiet for a moment. "Good parts. The best parts," Ethan said. Ray nodded and went back to work. That was enough for Ray, which was one of the things Ethan had always loved about his uncle. The gathering happened 3 days later. Cole organized it, not formally, not with ceremony, just a phone call to each of the people who'd been part of the previous day's events, and an address and a time. Roy's house again, because Roy's house had become, in the space of 3 days, the place where this particular group of people knew to go. There were more of them this time. Word had moved the way word moves in communities where people have been waiting quietly for something to change, not through announcements, but through the specific vibration of news traveling between people who share a history. Marcus Webb brought 2 men Ethan hadn't met. Arthur Gaines brought Mira Castillo and her daughter. Maria came with Pete. Lou Strickland brought Roderick, the store manager, who shook Ethan's hand with both of his and said only, "Maria told me what happened. All of it." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Ethan's mother came. Sandra Carter had been at Aunt Patrice's for 2 days and had spent those 2 days receiving filtered versions of events from Ethan's careful phone calls. She arrived at Roy's house knowing more than she was supposed to know and less than she wanted to know, which was the condition she had operated in her entire adult life relative to her father's real history. She walked in and she looked at the people in the room. Cole, Roy Darnell, the Tate brothers, Arthur, all of them with the expression of someone encountering the full dimension of something they'd previously only seen the edge of. She looked at the jacket on her son's shoulders and she stood very still for a moment. Ethan crossed the room to her. She put her hand on the lapel of the jacket, the same hand that had taken that jacket off the hook in Billy's workshop 100 times without really seeing it, and she looked up at her son with an expression that was too full of too many things to name any of them cleanly. "He would have told me," she said quietly, "if he'd thought I needed to know." "He was protecting you," Ethan said. "I know," Sandra said. "I've always known there was something he was protecting me from. I just didn't know what it was." She looked at the room again. "These people, they all knew. Some of them," Ethan said. "Some of them knew pieces. And now the pieces are together." "And now it's done," Ethan said. "It's filed. It's moving. It can't be stopped." Sandra Carter looked at her son for a long moment. Her hand was still on the jacket. "Your grandfather," she said. And then she stopped, and Ethan could see her organizing words around something that didn't organize easily. "He used to sit in that workshop at night. I'd see the light on when I'd drive by, long after he should have been in bed. I used to think he was just tinkering. That's what he always said. Just tinkering." She looked at the room, at these people who had known a version of her father she hadn't. He was building something. "He was," Ethan said. "And now it's built," she said. And now it's done, he said again. Because it was done. And done was the word that mattered. The conversation in the room moved the way conversations in rooms like that move, not linearly, not on a program, but organically following its own logic. People finding each other and talking about the things they'd been holding separately and were now able to hold together. Ethan moved through it listening more than he talked, the way his grandfather would have. He watched Roy Hester laugh at something Arthur Gaines said, genuinely laugh. The specific, uncomplicated sound of a man who had been too heavy for laughter for too long and had just set the weight down. He watched Maria Ortega and Mira Castillo sit together and talk with the ease of people who had been on the same side of the same situation without knowing each other. He watched Dennis Farrow and Calvin Tate comparing something on their phones with the focused interest of two men who had found a shared topic neither of them knew they shared. Cole Harrison came to stand beside him. They stood in the room together for a moment without speaking, watching it. You know what Billy would say about all of this, Cole said. Probably that we took too long, Ethan said. Cole almost laughed, really almost. He'd say exactly that. He'd look at this room full of people who finally have something to celebrate, and he'd say, we could have done this 20 years ago if anyone had moved faster. He paused, and he'd be right. And he'd also be standing here enjoying every second of it while pretending he wasn't. Ethan looked at the jacket on his arm where the sleeve was visible, at the faded patch he'd been carrying for 3 months without knowing what he was carrying. Cole, he said, what happens to the chapter, the club, the people who've been operating under Kane's direction? What does the structure look like when he's out of it? Cole was quiet for a moment. That's a long process. What Victor built isn't going to disappear overnight just because Victor is gone. The people he put in place, the priorities he established, those have inertia. He looked at Ethan. But inertia can be redirected. By the right people, Ethan said. By people who understand what the structure was supposed to be for, Cole said carefully, before it became what it became. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about what his grandfather had built. Not just the documents, the principle underneath the documents. The specific belief that strength was not justified by itself, that it only had moral weight when it was directed toward people who had none. He thought about the hardware store, and the laundromat, and the flower shop, and the auto parts business, and all the other similar places that existed in the margins of communities, sustained by decades of family effort, perpetually vulnerable to the exact kind of pressure Victor Kane had specialized in. He thought about the jacket. I'm not Billy, he said. Nobody is asking you to be, Cole said, and I'm not going to pretend I understand this world the way you do, the way Roy does, the way Arthur does. He paused. But I understand what Billy's code was, and I understand what happened when the code stopped being enforced. He looked at the room. That seems like the kind of thing worth enforcing. Cole was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured in a specific way, the way of a man who has been careful for so long that care has become the default setting and who is now deliberately choosing to be less careful. The men in this room, Cole said, have been waiting for something worth standing behind. Not an institution, not a hierarchy, a principle. He looked at Ethan. They stood this week because you gave them a reason to. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Arthur Gaines across the room said something that made Sandra Carter laugh, a genuine laugh, sudden and surprised, and the sound of it moved through the house and landed on Ethan the way his mother's voice had always landed on him, warm and specific and irreplaceable. He thought about Roy's 22 years. He thought about Maria's father praying in a church every Sunday. He thought about Gerald Fitch deciding at some point in the last year that the weight of what he'd helped build had become heavier than the risk of dismantling it. He thought about all the uncoordinated, separate acts of conscience that had been happening in parallel and isolation without knowledge of each other, and that had converged in the space of 48 hours into something that couldn't be stopped. He thought about a nail above a lockbox, a key in plain sight, a jacket hanging by a door. His grandfather had known. Not the details, not Fitch, not the federal inquiry, not the specific convergence of timelines, but the principle. Billy Carter had known that the things he'd built and preserved and maintained with 30 years of patient, unglamorous, undramatic care would eventually reach the person who could use them. He'd structured his entire approach around that belief. He'd made every decision with the eventual handoff in mind, even when the handoff was decades away and the recipient was a child who didn't know what he was inheriting. He kept the jacket because the jacket was supposed to go somewhere. It had. 3 weeks later, the federal investigation produced its first formal charges. Victor Kane's attorneys released a statement confirming cooperation. Meridian Property Group's operations were officially suspended pending review. Gerald Fitch's cooperation was made public in the charging documents, which meant his name was finally visible in the context of the correct side of the story. The Ortega hardware store opened on a Tuesday morning with a small, hand-lettered sign in the window that Maria Ortega put up herself. It said, "Under the same family." Open as always. It had been there before, and it was still there now, and it would be there next year because the thing that had been trying to move it was gone. Mira Castillo's flower shop put a sign in its window the same day. So did Henderson's Auto Parts. So did the Ewan family laundromat. None of them coordinated it. They just each independently understood the same thing at the same moment. Ethan was at the garage when Cole sent him a photo of the 4 signs. He looked at it for a long time. He was elbow deep in a transmission at the time, and he had to set the phone down and pick his work back up, but the image stayed with him, 4 small handwritten signs in 4 windows on the same street, each one saying the same thing in different words. We're still here. He went to the workshop that evening. It was the first time he'd been back since the night he found the box. The box was at Whitfield's office now in proper legal custody, every document scanned and filed and entered into the federal record where it was safe and permanent and beyond anyone's ability to suppress. The workshop felt different without it, or maybe it felt the same, and Ethan was different, which amounted to the same thing. He stood in the middle of the space where Billy Carter had spent 50 years of his life fixing things. He looked at the workbench, the tools in their places, the specific organized logic of a man who believed that things maintained properly were things that worked when you needed them. He took the jacket off. He held it for a moment, the weight of it, the broken-in softness of 30-year-old leather, the faded patch that had stopped a room full of Hell's Angels on a Thursday night and set everything that followed into motion. He looked at it the way you look at something when you are trying to understand what it is. He understood now. It wasn't a symbol of what Billy had been. It was a record of what Billy had done. Every crack in the leather was a year of living by a specific code when living by that code cost something. Every frayed thread on the patch was a decision to hold to a principle when letting go would have been easier and safer and completely understandable. The jacket wasn't the story. The jacket was the proof that the story was real. He put it back on. Not because he was trying to be Billy Carter. He wasn't Billy Carter, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He was Ethan Carter, 26 years old, a mechanic who had learned in the space of 48 hours that his grandfather was the most deliberate and patient and principled man he was ever going to know, and that the inheritance he'd been left wasn't money or property or reputation. It was a standard, a specific, clear, unambiguous standard about what strength was for and who it was supposed to serve. He walked out of the workshop and locked the door behind him. Cole Harrison was leaning against his truck in the parking area, which meant Cole had known Ethan was going to the workshop tonight, which meant Cole Harrison paid attention to things the way Billy Carter had paid attention to things, which was one of the reasons they trusted each other for 30 years. Cole looked at him, at the jacket, at the expression on Ethan's face. "You good?" Cole asked. Ethan thought about Maria Ortega's sign in the window, about Roy Hester laughing in a room full of people, about his mother's hand on the lapel of the jacket and the word done, about Gerald Fitch making a decision somewhere in the middle of a year that cost him everything he'd built in exchange for the ability to sleep at night, about 4 signs and 4 windows saying we're still here. He thought about his grandfather drinking coffee in a hardware store 2 years ago, buying screws he didn't need, checking on a promise he'd made decades earlier, still watching, still paying attention, still carrying it. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I'm good." Cole nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They stood there for a moment in the quiet of the parking lot, 2 men on either side of a 30-year story that had finally found its ending. And the jacket on Ethan Carter's shoulders didn't carry fear anymore. It didn't carry grief. It carried what Billy Carter had always intended it to carry, the simple, unbreakable understanding that the people who have strength owe something to the people who don't, that a promise made in good faith doesn't expire when the person who made it dies, and that a patch doesn't make a man honorable. A man's choices give the patch its meaning. And that meaning, carried faithfully from one generation to the next, is the only legacy that actually lasts.